Welcome to the Home and Energy Chats webinar series and our episode about the Inflation Reduction Act and what it means for Maine homeowners. My name is Heather Chandler, and I am the owner of Green and Healthy Maine Homes. We have a fantastic presentation tonight with really some cutting edge information that is still evolving, as I'm sure you'll hear during the evening. I would like to start by thanking our sponsors, including our season sponsor, Senecal Construction Services, now offering net zero ready design build packages in Pownell, conveniently located just minutes from Portland, Freeport, and Brunswick. And also a word from our presenting sponsor, Royal River Heat Pumps.
Hi, I'm Scott Libby, owner of Royal River Heat Pumps. A long time ago, the Royal River, like most rivers, was an important part of life, powering mills and allowing a community to grow and flourish. Nowadays, we see what a river can help to create. We believe that ordinary people can come together to make a big difference too. This year, Royal River Heat Pumps will invest our advertising dollars into a new campaign we've launched called Ripple to River. Each month, we'll choose a different nonprofit organization whose focus is kids battling childhood illnesses. We'll tell you about their particular mission and let you know how you can help support them. We're also launching an online resource at rippletoriver.com, providing information and a link for donations. Little things can turn into big change. I'm Scott Libby from Royal River Heat Pumps in Freeport, and I hope you'll join us in making change happen for kids and families that are facing challenges that nobody ever wants to face. Visit rippletoriver.com to learn more and donate, and thank you.
Thank you to both of our sponsors tonight, and a quick overview of how the evening will flow. We will begin the webinar with presentations from each of our panelists, and then open it up to discussion time to review your questions. We did receive several questions through the registration process, so we have a bunch to start with. And if you have additional questions throughout the evening, as you hear the presentations, please go ahead and submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will try our best to get to all of them. A reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website, greenmainehomes.com, later this week. So if you want to share it with anyone or revisit if you have to leave early, that will be available to you. So if you are not familiar with us, Green and Healthy Maine Homes is dedicated to inspiring healthy, efficient, and future-ready Maine homes through a quarterly print magazine, the annual Green Home and Energy Show, an online business directory. We have monthly newsletters and an active social media presence. We share expert advice to inspire healthy, comfortable, efficient, and sustainable Maine homes. So please visit us at greenmainehomes.com to learn more. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for the evening. Thomas Tutor grew up on a small island in Penobscot Bay with a year-round population of about 600 people. He earned his BS in economics from the University of Mary Washington. He joined Revision Energy in 2015 as a solar and heat pump design specialist and has been managing that team for the past 4 years. Since 2017, he's been working towards achieving net zero on his 1928 Portland home by air sealing and installing heat pumps, a heat pump hot water heater, insulation, and in 2019, he installed 24 solar panels, which enabled him to achieve his long-time dream of powering his own life with clean energy. So we're really excited to hear from Thomas tonight. Welcome. And our second panelist is Nat Haslett, and Nat is the manager for legislative and regulatory affairs at Efficiency Maine, where he helps represent Efficiency Maine in Public Utilities Commission proceedings and other forums. His role with the Strategic Initiatives team involves tracking changes in laws and regulations that affect how the trust programs can best serve Maine's energy consumers. Prior to moving closer to family in Maine, he worked on regulatory affairs of a renewable energy services provider in San Francisco. So we are very excited to have you with us tonight, Nat and Thomas. And at this point, I will turn it over to Nat, who's going to kick off the presentations.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that introduction, Heather, and for inviting me to be with you all this evening. It's an exciting time for Maine and the country broadly as federal investment in supporting clean energy and energy efficiency reaches new levels, and the Inflation Reduction Act enacted back in August is a big part of that, with about $370 billion dedicated to clean energy and energy efficiency. And we'll get into some of those details here. But for now, great to go ahead to the next slide. Before jumping in, for those of you unfamiliar with Efficiency Maine, we are a quasi-state agency that administers programs to improve the energy efficiency of energy use in Maine and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'll quickly note that I've included our website link here at the bottom of this slide, efficiencymaine.com. That's the best place to go to get more information on all of our programs, and will be a great place to track updates related to some of the incentives that may shift based on implementation of some of the programs that we'll touch on related to the Inflation Reduction Act here. So with that, great to go on to the next slide. So there's far too much in the bill to touch on tonight. This slide highlights a few of the sections that I hope to touch on in a quick survey of some of the sections most relevant to homeowners and thinking about efficiency upgrades and electric vehicles, and hope to have time in the question and answers to return to sections that may be of a particular interest. So we'll start out with looking at updates to the tax credits for energy efficiency upgrades again, then looking at a couple of new rebate programs funded by the Inflation Reduction Act, and then again, looking at clean vehicles there. So good to go on to the next slide. Let's jump right into it, and could advance one more. So the Inflation Reduction Act made a number of changes to the 25C tax credit. This was previously known as the non-business energy property tax credit, had expired back in 2021 after a number of annual re-ups. This chart is noisy. That's the problem of having a regulatory affairs person put together a slide deck. But some of the top line messages I wanted to highlight are pretty exciting expansions in the meaningfulness of this credit, whereas the previous credits iteration in effect through the end of this year had provided up to 10% of the costs of efficiency projects up to a lifetime cap of $500. The revised credit covers up to 30% of qualified improvements up to an annual cap of $1,200. And notably, that cap is $2,000 instead of the $1,200 cap for heat pumps, heat pump hot water heaters, and certain biomass property as well. A couple of other notes to highlight is that the Inflation Reduction Act newly qualifies circuit panel upgrades, air sealing, and home energy audits, which were not previously qualified under the tax credit. Great to go on to the next slide. I'll touch on this one only briefly, but the Inflation Reduction Act made a few notable changes to the residential clean energy credit. This is the tax credit you would use to receive credit for, say, a solar rooftop installation. And key changes are bumping the credit back up to the 30% maximum level all the way through 2032. And beginning next year, battery storage will be newly qualified. Biomass will no longer be qualified under this tax credit, but as I just touched on, newly qualified under the 25C tax credit. And in the interest of time, we'll just keep ticking right through these. So next slide. I'll briefly note as well that the Inflation Reduction Act beefed up the credit for new construction of homes. And so new construction that meets the requirements of either the Energy Star program named here or DOE's Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Homes program have a beefed up incentive. Again, that's for new construction. We can move on to the next slide. So these tax credits are really exciting in the sense that it doesn't require an appropriation from Congress every few years to keep a budget, as many customers or as individuals are as interested in using them. There'll just be more tax credit available. That said, the tax credits are most relevant to individuals with sufficient tax liability to take advantage of them. And so it was exciting to see rebates included in the Inflation Reduction Act as an important incentive for driving customer interest in efficient technologies and supporting those of lower income who may have lower tax liability. It's exciting that Efficiency Maine already has some robust rebate programs in place, and we're well positioned to administer these programs that have been developed in the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'll touch on both of them now. So you could go ahead to the next slide. So the first of the two rebate programs for efficiency upgrades provided in the Inflation Reduction Act is colloquially known as the Homes Rebate Program. This is a program to provide rebates for retrofits based on measured or modeled improvements in overall energy use at the home. And a theme, as Heather had touched on from the beginning, is that there are still plenty of open questions on what this program will ultimately look like. We're currently awaiting guidance from the Department of Energy, the agency tasked with administering these funds, and working to provide input from that to them in a stakeholder process that will kick off in the coming months. And we'll then be continuing our work for a plan to administer the program and developing an application to submit to the Department of Energy to actually receive the funds, which will total about $36 million to Maine, potentially more if other states choose not to access this funding. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So I've got another noisy chart for you here, but what this lays out are the tiers of the incentive levels available as provided under the law, with, again, further refinement to be made at the state level as implementation is finalized. But as you can see, there are two basic tracks to receiving credit for energy savings. One, achieving a modeled energy savings of at least 20%, or achieving measured energy savings of at least 15%, with different rebate structures associated with each. I'll highlight that for low and moderate income households defined as less than 80% of area and median income, the rebate rate doubles to a hefty 80% of project costs and up to $8,000, whichever is lower. And with that, we can keep moving on to the next slide. So the second of the two rebate programs provided under the Inflation Reduction Act of the IRA is called the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program, or HERE is the acronym that's often used to describe it. And this program is intended to support point of sale rebates, similar to the rebates that Efficiency Maine currently offers for a variety of equipment, including heat pumps. And this program is specifically intended to target low and moderate income consumers. In this case, that is defined as households with income less than 150% of area median income. And we're at a similar stage in the process, implementation process here and with the Homes program. We're still working to provide input to DOE as they develop guidance, and then again, we'll be applying for funding to then administer the program here at the state level. As with the Homes program, we don't expect these dollars to be available to customers until the end of next year at the earliest. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So this table lays out the maximum allowed rebate levels under the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program. And again, these numbers are not exactly what customers may ultimately see as we go through the process of determining what an appropriate and cost-effective level will be in conjunction with some of the incentive that we already offer here in Maine. But really exciting to again see just how robust this rebate is intended to be, in particular for customers with annual income less than 80% of the area median. Rebates can cover up to 100% of the project costs, subject to the caps shown for each of the types of equipment in the table here. And so this includes everything from heat pumps to electric wiring and insulation. And more details to discuss, but in the interest of time, let's keep on trucking. So on clean vehicle tax credits, the Inflation Reduction Act also makes a number of exciting changes, and you can go ahead to the next slide. So the 30D tax credit, this is for new vehicles, is a tax credit that has existed for some time. Changes under the Inflation Reduction Act both beef up the credit and add some new hurdles to accessing it. So to highlight just one example from the requirements listed on this slide, a cap on the number of vehicles that each manufacturer could sell that could qualify for the rebates will be lifted next year, effective next year. But there are new requirements for domestic manufacturing, some of which that have already gone into effect as of August of this year when the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, and new requirements for battery materials sourcing that create some real hurdles for manufacturers as well. Note that there are also new requirements for limits on the MSRP of the vehicles that can qualify, and new income restrictions on qualifying buyers as well. And we can go ahead to the next slide. It was exciting to see the Inflation Reduction Act include a tax credit for used clean vehicles. This is a new tax credit that has not existed previously. As you can see, a credit of up to $4,000 or 30% of the vehicle sale price, whichever is lower. And again, a variety of requirements laid out here on this slide. I won't bore you with reading each of them off, but one note that applies to both the used clean vehicle tax credit and the tax credit for new clean vehicles beginning in 2024 will be an option for customers to receive a discount at the time of sale by effectively transferring the tax credit to the dealer. And this is again an exciting way for those with lower tax liabilities to begin with to take advantage of a meaningful incentive to adopt cleaner vehicles. And we can go ahead to the next slide. We're focused here on mostly residential applications, so I won't go through the details of this tax credit, but did want to note that the Inflation Reduction Act also now provides a tax credit for commercial vehicles, and it's notable that some of the domestic manufacturing and material sourcing requirements that are a barrier to some of the vehicle eligibility under the new vehicle tax credit do not apply to this commercial clean vehicle tax credit. And we can keep jumping on to the next slide. The Inflation Reduction Act did reinstate a tax credit for electric vehicle charging equipment, and does impose some new restrictions on the geographic siting of chargers, but otherwise maintains a 30% credit up to $1,000, which had been in effect prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. And we can move on to the next slide. So I'll now, again, providing just a very high level survey here, look to tie some of these exciting new provisions back to the work we're doing here at Efficiency Maine day to day, and how we're thinking about implementation. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So at a high level, it's super exciting to have more funding and the tax credits available to support the core work we do. Having this federal support means that Efficiency Maine can stretch its budget to reach more consumers, more households, more businesses. Investment beyond the state of Maine in the market more broadly also cascades benefit to individuals here as well by investing in the technologies more broadly, and helping bring down the cost curve for for their production as well. And ultimately, the hope is that that translates to cheaper and lower energy costs for Mainers, and that technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles with lower operating costs than the technologies they're displacing can allow lower energy use and lower costs overall. As I've touched on, implementation is very much still a work in progress, so there are plenty of open questions about what some of the details of program guidelines will look like for, say, the rebate programs, where the Department of Energy will take the first stab at outlining requirements. And so we're still evaluating adjustments to our own rebates and incentives programs based on that pending guidance, both at DOE and also as the Treasury develops requirements through the IRS as well around the tax credits. And then this last bullet segues to my last slide, which is that contrary to perhaps popular belief, our incentive levels are not pulled out of thin air, and we can jump ahead to the next slide, where I've outlined just a few of the guiding principles that we use in setting our incentive levels. In general, we're looking to provide a rational incentive that induces action as cost effectively as possible. And so rebate levels look different depending on whether it's a retrofit to replace and a piece of equipment before the end of its useful life, or new construction, or replacement on burnout. And in general, we're looking to make exceptions or provide higher incentives where there may be additional barriers for customers to adopt a piece of equipment, say low-income customers. In general, federal funds come with restrictions that may create gaps, and so it's typically our approach to use federal funding first when it can be stacked with other incentives, and then look to stretch state and local funds to fill in those gaps. And of course, as with all our programs, we're looking to minimize use of incentives by those who would have done the upgrades anyway, what we call free ridership, and continuously learning from both our programs that we administer within the state and the results of programs to offer clean energy technologies and efficient technologies in other states as well. So I will wrap there and hand it back over to you, Heather, but looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. There's so much there. There's some really great resources. So I thank you for that overview. And I know that there's a lot more information to come on that. So I am at this point going to turn it over to Thomas, who's going to dive in a little bit more on how the IRA relates to residential electrification.
Thank you. And I've got probably way too many slides here, so I'm going to be jumping through these pretty quick. Get ready for my next here, Rain, and we can jump in here. Just a quick background on Revision. Feel super fortunate to be working with over 380 employee owners now, and we are a B Corp, meaning we're really trying to think about the triple bottom line, not just profits, but people and the planet as well. And on the next slide, we've got our mission statement, which is pretty ambitious. We really think that electrification offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to more evenly distribute wealth from our energy economy and reduce localized negative effects of fossil fuel use on disadvantaged communities. So the IRA is a really exciting step and really big, bold climate legislation that is kind of confusing, but is going to mean basically an electrification bank account for every American. So let's go on to the next slide and set the stage a little bit on sort of the why. 87% of US emissions here come from energy, and roughly half of those emissions come from decisions that individual households make at the kitchen table. So that's how you heat your home, what you put in your car to get around. So our energy choices really do matter, and the IRA will make it far easier for Americans to choose the cleaner, smarter options. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little perspective globally, we do have more work to do here in the US than anywhere else due to our high energy use and correlated carbon emissions. That's why the world, not just Americans, are excited about the IRA, because US consumption and manufacturing of electrification technology will have big positive global impacts. So next slide, we can see that in New England, in Maine, we are the highest carbon emitters per capita, largely due to the fact that we heat more than 60% of our homes with oil boilers, and we got a really old housing stock. So the IRA is going to help us as Mainers, address that problem, which again, like the US, it's a big problem, but a big opportunity for savings and local economic benefits. And the next slide will show us quickly that, we really have the tools that we need for energy efficiency, electricity decarbonization, and fuel switching. That is what we have to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. 80% by 2050 is shown in this forecast. So on the next slide, we're not telling everybody that they need to go live off the grid like this and grow all their own food. Although certainly growing your own food and composting is something I fully support and think everybody should get involved with, even on just a hobby scale. But if you see the next slide, this is what Revision Energy is helping New Englanders get to, which is the solar household, where you make all the electricity you need, either on your roof or in your backyard, or some there and some in a community solar farm share, or all at a community solar farm share. You really have all the options here in Maine, which is amazing. And the IRA legislation, each of these technologies shown here now qualifies for a 30% federal tax credit. So not just solar, but batteries now have their own 30% federal tax credit, as we heard from Nat, and electric vehicle chargers and heat pumps and heat pump water heaters also have a 30% federal tax credit, but there is a cap of $1,000 for EV chargers, $2,000 for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, and those are counted in the same bucket. But that is a federal tax credit each year. So theoretically, you could install heat pumps in 2023 and get a tax credit. And if that was going to max out your 2,000, you could install a heat pump water heater the following year and get up to another 2,000, which is sort of an interesting aspect of the legislation, because that tax credit does offer that $2,000 for heat pump technology each year for the next 10 years. So next slide. I think it's really nice way to think about this as just trying to make these clean electric technologies the obvious replacement for the roughly 1 billion fossil fuel machines that we've got to replace in this country. And the faster we do it, the better we're all going to be in the future and in the near term on our energy costs. So in the next slide, you can see really quickly, I'll brag about my house for a second, and you can jump down to the next one and see this is my home's energy usage on a day, I think last week. We've had a pretty remarkable November for solar generation. So you can see the red of the graph on the left side. That is my house using electricity from the grid overnight. My heat pump's running a little bit, my refrigerator. And then you can see about 6:30, sun comes up and hits my panels. I start making power on my roof, and that electricity in blue is made on my roof and consumed by my home in real time. So that's solar self-consumption. And then you can see the green is excess solar energy that I made during that sunny day that I didn't need at that time. It flows automatically back into the grid and actually flows to my neighbors' homes, but I get credit for it. And the green credits work off the red. So next slide, we'll see how that works, over the course of a year. This is really what your utility CMP does, is just look at how much you imported from the grid. If we're looking at the bottom, this is really what your bill will look like, is import and export. And it allows you to export extra kilowatt hours every month in the solar and bank those up, and then use those off in the winter when you're using your heat pumps to run your home and heat your home. So we've got, simple one-to-one net metering in Maine, which is a nice, simple, straightforward system that works very well for full electrification. So next slide, just a quick summary. Solar panels make power on the roof, flows to an inverter that converts that energy to alternating current AC. It's what your home runs on, and you use that in real time, and any excess automatically flows back into the grid. So all the electricity in your house runs exactly as it used to. You just start adding to it whenever the sun is shining. So next slide, it's important to understand, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act, that you don't have to have all the money for a solar array up front. More and more Americans are financing solar because, when everybody asks me, so how much does solar cost? Well, the answer is, how much do you spend on your electric bill? Because whatever that is, you can trade that bill for a comparable solar loan payment. And then you can really lock in your electricity costs for that solar loan term. And as your neighbors' rates go up, you're locked in paying that solar loan payment. And once it's paid off, obviously, then you own that system outright. So important to remember that when we're thinking about full electrification, especially people who don't have that money in the bank that will honestly benefit from the energy savings the most. So excited to see how the Maine Green Bank receives funds and maybe allows for some better financing options in the future. But if we go to the next slide here, you can just a quick comparison of utility rate today. And if you finance your solar project, you're still paying less than what the utility is charging you. And obviously, if you don't pay any interest, you're even better off. Yeah, you can jump to the next slide. I'm going to keep running here pretty quickly. Solar and heat pumps, all these efficiency upgrades, they do also add resale value to your home. But we won't spend too much time on this. We can jump to the next one. Important to remember that community solar is an option. Everybody's gotten mailers that are subscription solar farm offerings, which is a good option. And community solar is just super inclusive because you don't have to own your own roof. And if you have issues or don't have the roof space, anybody can join community solar. The next slide will show us there is two types of community solar in Maine. The subscription is all those mailings that are real. You get a savings. You're supporting clean energy generation in Maine. If you don't know what you're doing in the next few years, then maybe that's a good option. If you're planning to be paying a CMP bill for at least a few more years, then the ownership model might be better for you. You do get the federal tax credit, which has returned now to 30%. If you own your own portion of a large ground mounted array with an ownership model community solar farm, like the next slide shows. So we've been building as many of these as we can. Our next couple are actually already full. So we're looking at our next one not coming on until 2024. But the next slide shows that, the economics of community solar are great, better than just continuing to rent your electricity from the utility. And you can finance an ownership model farm on the right side and still be better off. But we'll keep rolling here on the next slide, sort of get back to those other technologies that are in this 100% solar household, and jump right into the next slide and think a little bit about battery storage, which now has its own 30% federal tax credit. It used to be that you only got a tax credit for battery storage if it was connected to solar, which honestly still recommend that you do connect your battery to solar because that's how it can be recharged during an outage and really provide this unlimited power supply if you're really conscious of how much you're using and what your future forecast for sun exposure is the next few days. But you're not reliant on a generator and a fuel truck coming to refill that generator. If you do have a properly sized battery and solar array and proper expectations about your loads and what you can do in an outage. So next slide, I don't know if anybody knows who this guy is. But Bill Nye, the science guy, has got a few power walls here on his home. I think he's in California. We don't install our battery systems outside in Maine, although they are technically rated for it. Nice part about the Tesla Powerwall is it stacks power and energy, which we won't get into today, but we'll just say if you know the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour, then you've really done your homework and you're far ahead of a lot of Americans. But we'll jump to the next slide and talk just briefly about heat pumps. You know, there's already some great state rebates out there. We've now got the 30% federal tax credit up to $2,000. And as Nat mentioned, there's going to be some additional state rebate money for income eligible Mainers that we don't know those details quite yet. So next slide, heat pump water heaters. I got one of these in my basement as well as 2 heat pumps, and really simple, like a refrigerator in reverse. Also dehumidify your basement while they work. I highly recommend if you're burning fossil fuels, you should have a heat pump water heater. You only need like 3 solar panels on your roof to run this thing for the year. And we'll jump to the next slide and talk a little bit about solar electric vehicles. You know, if you are driving an electric vehicle, then you can make all the energy that it uses. You need roughly 8 panels to power, you know, about 12,000 miles of driving annually in a Chevy Bolt. I'm really excited about the new DC fast chargers that Revision's installing in Newport, Bangor, Ellsworth, Belfast, to go with, you know, ones already along the 295 corridor in Kennebunk and West Gardner, and some up in the Western Maine mountains. So with those new ones that are going to come in online this winter, I think we really got a nice DC fast charging network that you can get to most places in the state. And if you look outside of Maine, Quebec, and south, there's even more. So I think EVs are really exciting place right now. And yeah, highly encourage everyone to take a look at the options, especially over the next couple of years. The tax credit for these is confusing, and the manufacturers don't quite know what's going to qualify yet. So it's $7,500 tax credit for a new electric vehicle. Half of that is for battery components. And if those are, there's like a ratcheting up of the proportion of those that are made in the US, or I think it's actually North America, or 12 different free trade countries. And same with the battery raw materials. So there's a lot to be figured out, but it is incentivizing domestic production, both of the batteries and the vehicles, which might be a little bit of a challenge in the near term to get those tax credits, but I think ultimately is going to really help the industry long term and provide some nice incentives. So we'll jump to the next one really quickly, just sort of a reminder of why we're working on this, which is, you know, to electrify all those things that currently make noise and are powered by corrosive, flammable, toxic little tanks of fuel that we have around us all the time. That I think, you know, in the future, when kids are learning about the history of our civilization, I think they'll think it was kind of crazy how we had these things so close to us in every part of our life. So, you know, we're getting to a point where we don't have to burn stuff all the time. We've got a massive burning ball of fire out there that's sending us plenty of energy, and we're just got to build the infrastructure to harness it and then use that clean electricity to use, you know, to run our lives. So next slide, just to show you a little perspective of how quickly things can change. And I think the IRA is a really powerful inflection point in this transition. But, here's 1890 in Manhattan. You can see the form of transportation, and you don't really see the horse manure on the streets, but I can assure you it was there. And then if you jump to the next slide, we can see, just 10 years later, that form of transportation has been completely overturned. And now there's not manure in the streets, but there is, carbon emissions and smog and pollution coming out of each one of those engines. So next slide. This transition is happening. Portland's got 3 electric buses that have come online this summer. Saw one just the other day. I think the bus fleet is actually going to electrify probably quicker than any other sort of form of vehicle because of how sort of reliable and dependable the routes are and the charging infrastructure. There's a bunch of grants that Maine schools just won for electric school buses, which obviously has some benefit in the clean, reduction of idling around our children. So next slide, as we kind of wrap up here, I do think, we're seeing, I saw a new term, fossilflation, really that a big part of inflation right now is due to fossil fuel energy and the war in Ukraine that is driving up costs. And I think we're about to see our electric costs in Maine go up a little bit more with the standard offer rate jumping up a little bit in January. I think it will be announced what that new standard offer rate is sometime in the next week or two. So, I think it's important to think about how we control those energy costs and take control of our sort of future. And it's something that you can really do to help your local economy and our country, which is why Inflation Reduction Act is a big part and incentive in helping that. So next slide, we've been helping Mainers do this for the past 20 years. Look forward to this next decade. The next slide shows you all the projects that we've done in New England. Just hit over the 14,000 mark. And yeah, it's just a really exciting time to help really get this technology out to everyone. And I'll close with kind of a summary on the next slide and point you to a resource, which is the Rewiring America is a nonprofit organization that was really influential in getting this legislation passed, along with, countless others. But they have a great savings calculator that does reference, the area median income. So you can plug in these different pieces and get a sense of what you might be eligible for. And the next slide, I'll just summarize. I sort of see it on the residential scale, there's sort of really 2 parts to the IRA. There's the state rebates that will flow through Efficiency Maine, and that we've got to wait for some more details on. So that's the rebate side, and that's the income dependent side. And then there's the federal tax credit side, which is summarized here, where all those technologies I'm talking about qualify for a 30% tax credit. There are the maxes on heat pump water heaters and heat pumps. And then there's, home insulation, doors, windows, and home energy audits also have those small tax credits shown there. All right, I think I maybe did it in time. I was kind of rushing. I got a final slide that just to put a plug out there for, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but Revision put out a video recently called Electricians Will Save the World, because in this transition, electricians are really going to be the largest bottleneck to getting all this awesome technology installed and built out there. It's going to employ roughly 25 million more Americans in this transition as we replace those 1 billion fossil fuel machines. There are jobs in every zip code, and a lot of them are electricians, and we need a lot more electricians. So if you know of anybody, please send them to check out our apprenticeship program at revisionenergy.com careers. This just gives you an example of that career pathway. I've recruited some of my friends the last few years, so it's fun to be bringing people in, and the excitement of being part of this, building this cleaner, more just energy future. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you both. This is very exciting, and so many new opportunities for Maine homeowners. We have a ton of questions that have come in, so I'm going to dive right into these so that we can make a pretty good stab at them over the next 20-25 minutes. This one's really a summary, Nat, of some information you shared, but the question is, how are heat pump rebates changing, including for low income? So could you do a quick recap on that?
Sure, glad to. The first thing I'd really emphasize is that, of course, we have existing rebate incentives available. And so going to our website, efficiencymaine.com, is a great way to understand the details there. And then in terms of the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act's rebate programs, there's still a number of open questions that DOE has to answer in setting program guidelines that we'll then be looking at as we refine implementation here at the state level. So again, the timeline there will hopefully be guidance from DOE as early as the first or second quarter, likely closer to the second quarter of next year, and hopefully funds then available to customers by the end of the year through that new federal avenue. But again, efficiencymaine.com will be a great place to track how our incentives are evolving as we look to set reasonable levels that do help us better access, in particular, low and moderate income customers who are especially prioritized with the federal dollars under those rebate programs.
Great, thank you. There's a question about referencing political changes. How safe is the IRA? Is there any chance that it could be, if leadership changes, it could be overturned in the future?
It's a great question. Anything is possible. Our political climate is always changing. I would note that in general, tax credits, I touched on this briefly, don't require, say, annual appropriations of funding to actually fund those programs. And so those are usually somewhat insulated, therefore, by some of the year-to-year wrangling over dollars. So that's really exciting. And then in terms of some of the rebate programs I touched on, part of the urgency, I would say, from the federal level to get that money to states would be to then again insulate from any changes at the federal level that could create an environment more hostile to clean energy programs. I would say the outcomes of the midterm elections within the Senate point to that not being a huge concern in the short term. So anything's possible, but in general, through the near term and for the tax credits, these programs look to be in good shape to remain available.
Yeah, I'll just tag on. As I understand it, this legislation has passed, therefore a legislation would have to be passed to negate this, which I think is very unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you. Question, I think I'm gonna shoot this one to you first, Thomas, but certainly feel free, both of you, to tag team as needed. But question, what can I do as a first-time homeowner to benefit from this act? So somebody who's just bought their first house, where would you recommend that they start in terms of benefiting from the IRA?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there's a lot of different benefits out there for electrification of that home. So, I think it is always a good idea in a new home to think about the envelope. So your insulation, your air sealing, Efficiency Maine already has awesome rebates that I have fully maxed out at my house with spray foam insulation in my basement. And then I just completed an attic insulation project. And then, once you've tightened up that building envelope, then heat pumps are really the best way to go. You may still need some kind of supplemental heat depending on, how your home's laid out. And you definitely want to get that water heating off of the boiler that it's likely on and onto a heat pump water heater if you've got a basement that can fit it. And then try to make all the electricity to run all those systems with your roof or with a community solar farm share. That's a quick take.
Great, thank you. Anything to add to that one, Nat?
Nope, I would, yep, again, the risk of being a broken record, our website has a great summary of many of these rebates and incentives. And for the tax credits, which are of course through the federal level, something we don't administer directly, guidance will be coming out on how the IRA has affected those in the coming months as well.
Great. There's a question about the areas of the IRA that you had mentioned that won't go into effect until the end of 23 at the earliest. Will any work that's completed prior to those or that clarification coming out, will that be covered? Is it retroactive?
It's a good question. In general, I would expect no. And pending further refinement of those guidelines. Again, would really note that the tax credits will be effective as of January 1. The expanded tax credits, existing rebates that we already offer in place, mean that the benefit of some of the energy savings that you could achieve already, I would encourage you not to wait around. And lastly, would point out that certainly the Inflation Reduction Act helps bring funding to certain targeted customers, again, particularly low income. It may or may not be relevant to you as a homeowner, depending on your means as well as you look at options available to you.
Great. Are these max rebate amounts lifetime on the property or per project? So I guess that means if somebody moves to a new home, can they begin again, or is it by person?
It's a good question, Thomas. I'd welcome your input here as well. I understand it to be the taxpayer is how it's defined for the program currently. So moving to a new home would not necessarily qualify you for more. And the IRS is likely to clarify that further in supplemental guidance.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, because it's through your tax filing. So it's not connected to an address. It is, your taxes for each year. You have these tax credits available. The solar and battery tax credits there's no annual or there's no cap. So it's whatever your total expenditure is on solar batteries, you get 30% off your federal income tax liability. And then for those other ones with a cap, those are annual caps. So if you did it at one home 1 year and you move to another home the next year, that's a next year. So you're in a new year for tax filing and those caps. So yeah, connect to the taxpayer, not the address.
Makes sense. Are non-resident residential property owners eligible for Efficiency Maine rebates?
Again, I direct you to our website for more specific details by program or incentive. For example, I know that, say, for electric vehicle rebates we offer, you are required to be a Maine resident. And off the top of my head, say for a heat pump rebate, I believe requirements along the lines of using that equipment through the heating season. So for some of those nuances, would direct you to the website. And Thomas, looks like you might have more information as well.
Yeah, on the heat pump one, that's my understanding that it is, you must use that heat pump for year-round heating. So You don't have to be a Maine resident. It can be on a second home in Maine, but if that home is not heated through the winter, and you're not using that heat pump for heat in the winter, then you do not qualify for the Efficiency Maine rebate.
Nat, can you revisit the incentives for insulating and air sealing? And there's a question about whether tax credits can be carried over many years until they're used up. I think we've touched on that already, but maybe a recap in case that was missed.
Sure. So yeah, in addition to rebates, incentives that Efficiency Maine already offers, and the 25C tax credit that I touched on that has actually existed as well, but is now beefed up, and Thomas summarized it especially well in some of those slides with graphics. There is now up to a 30% tax credit, up to $1,200 for building envelope components. There are requirements under that 25C tax credit that limit expenditures, say on windows, to a total of $600 a year. Doors, I believe it's $500 in aggregate. But air sealing recently qualified newly under that tax credit is exciting. The rebate programs as well would also, that are funded under the IRA, would also support insulation, air sealing, as the high efficiency electric home rebate program does. I don't remember the cap off the top of my head on what the law provides for. In the homes rebate, the performance-based rebate, it'll be interesting to see which technologies are the best way to achieve that whole home performance improvement. Something like a heat pump, likely a more direct way to achieve savings than envelope, but envelope could certainly be a part of that that upgrade as well.
Great.
And I believe there was a question on carry forward. My understanding, and Thomas, you can help me out here, I don't believe the 25C tax credit, again, this is for efficiency upgrades, does not allow carry forward, but again, that's an annual cap there, so a credit that could be accessed in successive years. My understanding is that the 25D credit, so for, say, a solar panel, that is a credit that can be carried forward. Again, welcome your confirmation of that, Thomas, or clarification.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Those, and I assume the battery tax credit is the same like the solar. There's no annual cap, and so if you max out your tax liability, meaning you don't have to pay any federal income tax because you had a large tax credit, and there's more of that solar or battery tax credit, that does roll forward to subsequent years. But I expect those other tax credits with an annual cap do not, because you got that tax credit again for the next year, but that would be for another project, is my understanding.
That makes sense. Thomas, you had mentioned the Maine Green Bank in your presentation. And we have a question about, what does the IRA Act mean for Maine's Green Bank? How much funding for low interest microloans for building energy efficiency? How much funding is there for low interest microloans for building energy efficiency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if Nat has any more details. I don't really accept that. I know we were smart to create the Maine Green Bank prior to this legislation, even though it hasn't really gotten any funding, but now is a vehicle to receive federal funding. Shout out to David Gibson and others who worked on that. And I don't know, Nat, if you know more about when or how much funding or how that's going to work.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I hadn't had time to include it in that initial introduction, but Thomas, to your point, it is exciting that the Green Bank vehicle within Efficiency Maine is well positioned to take advantage of this funding and help make it available to Mainers. They're much like some of the rebate programs that will be administered through the Department of Energy and then by the state. There are a lot of open questions. So the IRA allocated about $27 billion to the EPA to administer a greenhouse gas reduction fund or a green bank, or provide funding to green banks. It'll actually be made available on a competitive basis. So it's definitely an open question how much will flow to the individual states. They're currently soliciting input. We'll help provide feedback as well on what their administration of those funds, what that structure will look like. they're supposed to be dispersing funds beginning as early as February of next year. We'll see if they're able to meet that deadline. But more to come there.
Great. Question about how somebody would find out what the area median income is to find out whether they qualify for the 80% or 50%.
Yes, I would say pending further, that's exactly an example of what further guidance from the Department of Energy will be helpful in providing. So I don't have a precise answer for you at this time. There are some general, and Thomas, you may have some additional input to provide here, but I would say that's not yet finalized at this point.
Yeah, all I could direct people to is rewiringamerica.org. They have a calculator that is using the best available data, but I think, like Nat says, there's some details still to be figured out. And yeah, exactly how those dollars will flow through state agencies and then be awarded. So, but I check rewiringamerica.org for the best info to date.
Nice. Do they also have a summary of all of the rebates and such that we've covered tonight?
Yeah, they've got great info on there. They've got that calculator, but they've also got, so there's a like 12-page document that runs through the whole Inflation Reduction Act, but they've got some sort of smaller summary blurbs too.
Okay, we'll include a link to that then in the email follow-up that goes out to everybody who registered. And there was also a question about whether the slides were accessible after the webinar, and we do record the webinar and that'll be posted on our website. So if at any time you want to go back and refer to any information on the slides, there was a lot there, so you can certainly pause and slow down and absorb. So that will be available later this week. So let's see, I'm just scrolling through here to see what we haven't touched on. Somebody had a question about the tax credit incentives and radiant floor heating. I haven't seen anything in the IRA about radiant floor heating, but have either of you?
Yeah, so radiant floor heating, is a type of distribution. So it's not a type of heating system, as far as the heat source. So, radiant floors are, as opposed to baseboard or, a forced hot air system. It's an interesting question. There are a few technologies that are heat pump systems. You're looking for an air to water heat pump that runs radiant floors. There is some equipment that's available in Europe. Some of that equipment is not available in the US. That's not UL listed. There are some that we've experimented with and are not currently offering. So the best option for radiant floor heating, in my opinion right now, is an electric boiler, which is a very simple machine. And then you can power that with solar. You don't get the efficiency of a heat pump, but the heat pump technology, I think, is not quite there for air to water heat pumps, at least in our experience.
Great, thank you. Question about CMP. What are the chances of CMP streamlining the interconnection process turnaround time?
Yeah, I do think there's I'll pull back that question a little bit and sort of answer it, but just in a broad strokes, I think the best opportunity for bringing down the cost of solar in this country is through reducing permitting and interconnection costs and time and complexity. If you look at, solar installed costs in Europe and Australia, it's significantly less than the US because they have really streamlined approaches to permitting and interconnection. I will plug the solar app that's APP. It's an automated permitting program that the Department of Energy has put together over the last couple of years, and they're trying to help municipalities and cities adopt that to enable a much faster permitting process for solar. And, you know, time is money. That reduces costs for the solar contractor, reduces costs for the city, and that leads to lower costs for consumers. So it's not particularly sexy, but I do think that's a really good opportunity for people to encourage town officials. And the DOE wants to help people get that platform up and running for their town. So it's a lift in the beginning, but then it's much less work for the town and for solar contractors. That is not what the question was, which is about interconnections with the utility. I think that one is harder to solve. And we, you know, work with the utility every day, and, you know, we're doing a lot of different work, but there are times where it is very challenging. And that's kind of just the nature of the industry right now.
Yeah. Nat, can the credits, so the efficiency Maine benefits and the IRA benefits, are they stackable? Can people tap both of them?
Yeah, so the tax credits, yes, that's pretty straightforward in that sense. Hopefully this presentation was a little bit, provided some additional color on how we think about where for the rebate program some of those dollars will yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced about how we would think of adapting our incentives to leverage those the most effective way possible.
Great. Question about whether someone can install a heat pump to warm up their basement. Thomas, you want to do that one?
Yeah, sure. Yes, you can totally install a heat pump in your basement. I've designed some heat pump systems that include a unit in the basement. I think it really depends on how much you want to use that space in the winter. If you're using that basement space and you want it to be conditioned, then putting a heat pump down there makes tons of sense. And then, you know, does reduce the heating load above. I don't have a heat pump in my basement. I don't have any fossil fuel boiler down there. I do have a little wood stove that I use when it's super cold out. But I just insulated my basement, I think is sort of what I recommend before you think about putting a heat pump in, unless you've got space down there that you want conditioned throughout the winter. So it's a use case, I think.
Yeah, but it is possible if somebody wanted to put a heat pump in the basement.
Totally possible.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a heat pump water heater. I highly recommend a heat pump water heater in your basement, but I think the question was about a ductless air source heat pump, which does make sense in some basements.
Well, we have come to the end of our Q&A, so I want to thank you both for all of the information that you shared tonight. I know that there are still many unanswered questions, but it sounds like there's a lot of great information already available, and some of the incentives went into place immediately this fall. Others take effect January 1st, and it sounds like still others maybe the end of next year. So we look forward to hearing more about that. If you attended tonight and have additional questions that we didn't get to, our presenters have offered to share their contact information in the follow-up email, so we will send you that. I would like to say thank you again to our sponsors, Royal River Heat Pumps and Senecal Construction Services. Thank you to Rain Rayner, who has been managing everything so beautifully behind the scenes. You don't see her, but she's helped everything move very smoothly. And thank you, Nat and Thomas, for sharing all of your expertise and your time with us tonight. I really appreciate everything that you brought to the webinar. So please mark your calendars for our next chat, which takes place on December 6th, and it is definitely one you won't want to miss. It is all about embodied carbon in residential construction, so a really nice next step for the conversation we started tonight. And our one of our lead presenters that night is Jacob Racusin from New Frameworks in Vermont, and he has literally written the book on this topic. So I think it's going to be really nice to have him with us. A reminder, I think I mentioned a couple of times, we do share recordings on our website. They'll be up in a couple of days, so you can access this again. And lastly, you will see a brief survey pop up after you close the webinar. We'd love to hear from you, your feedback on tonight's session, any ideas you have for future sessions. We would love to hear them. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thanks, Nat and Thomas.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.